The slap echoed through the crowded mall like a gunshot, but it was the silence that followed that would bring an empire to its knees. Evelyn Washington moved through Montgomery Mall with the measured grace of someone who had learned long ago that every step in public was a statement. At 73, she carried herself with a dignity that seemed to emanate from some deep, unshakable source. Her silver hair was perfectly arranged beneath a modest hat, and her navy dress, though clearly not expensive, was pressed to perfection. She paused at the jewelry counter, her weathered fingers tracing the edge of her wedding ring as she studied a display of anniversary bands. 48 years, she whispered to herself, her voice carrying the weight of memories. The ring had grown loose on her finger since Harold passed 6 months ago, but she couldn't bring herself to resize it. Somehow, keeping it exactly as he'd placed it there felt like keeping him close. The elderly woman pulled out a small photograph from her purse, Harold in his graduation robes from law school, that brilliant smile that had first caught her attention in 1952. She'd been carrying the photo everywhere lately, a talisman against the loneliness that seemed to follow her like a shadow. "Can I help you with something?" The young saleswoman's voice was kind, genuine. "Oh no, dear. Just looking." Evelyn tucked the photograph away carefully. "My husband used to say that jewelry stores were dangerous places to bring your wife." Her laugh was soft, tinged with grief. He was right about that. 3 stores down, Jordan Matthews was having the kind of day that made him question every life choice that had led him to folding sweaters at Prestige Clothing. At 22, he'd been working retail for 3 years while taking night classes, always telling himself it was temporary. But temporary had a way of becoming permanent when you couldn't afford to take risks. "Jordan," the sharp voice of Mr. Hendricks, the store manager, cut through his thoughts. "That woman over there," he pointed toward a young black mother trying to corral 2 toddlers while shopping. "Keep an eye on her. You know how they get." Jordan's stomach twisted. He knew exactly what Hendricks meant, and he hated himself for never saying anything. The manager had been making these comments for months, always just subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability. Jordan told himself he needed this job, that speaking up would only make things worse. But the excuse felt thinner each time. "Sure, Mr. Hendricks," Jordan mumbled, hating the words as they left his mouth. "That's why I keep you around, Matthews. You understand how things work." Hendricks patted Jordan's shoulder in a way that felt more like marking territory than showing approval. Jordan watched the manager stride away, his expensive suit and slicked-back hair giving him the appearance of someone who'd confused authority with importance. At 55, Hendricks had been running stores in this mall for over a decade, and his reputation for maintaining standards was well known among staff. What most people didn't realize was how those standards seemed to shift based on the color of a customer's skin. Meanwhile, Evelyn had wandered toward the clothing section, drawn by a beautiful scarf in the window of Prestige Clothing. It was silk, a deep burgundy, that reminded her of the curtains in Harold's law office. She imagined wearing it to church on Sunday, how the other ladies in her congregation might compliment it. Such a small pleasure, but these days, she was learning to appreciate small pleasures. As she entered the store, Jordan noticed her immediately. There was something about the way she moved, unhurried but purposeful, as if she had all the time in the world but knew exactly how she wanted to spend it. She was examining the scarf display when Hendricks spotted her. "Another one," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for Jordan to hear. "Watch this." Evelyn selected a scarf, running the silk between her fingers. The price tag made her wince. $60 was more than she usually spent on herself. But Harold had always said she should have beautiful things. "You deserve the world, Evie," he used to say. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She was reaching for her wallet when Hendricks approached, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification before you handle the merchandise." Evelyn looked up, surprised. "I beg your pardon. Identification. We've had some issues with certain customers lately. Company policy." Jordan felt his chest tighten. He'd worked here for 8 months and had never heard of this policy. He watched other customers, white customers, handle merchandise freely, without anyone asking for ID. "I was just looking at this scarf," Evelyn said calmly, though something flickered in her eyes. I haven't even decided if I want to purchase it. Well, until I see some ID, I'll need you to put that down. The store had gone quiet. Other customers were pretending not to watch, but Jordan could feel the tension building like pressure before a storm. He wanted to say something, anything, but his throat felt paralyzed. Evelyn's hands shook slightly as she carefully placed the scarf back on the display. "Of course," she said softly. "I understand." But as she reached for her purse, the photograph of Harold slipped out, floating to the floor. As she bent to retrieve it, her shoulder accidentally brushed against another scarf, knocking it from its hanger. That's when everything changed. What would you do if you witnessed discrimination happening right in front of you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're invested in seeing justice served and want to know what happens next, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because this story is just getting started, and you won't want to miss how Evelyn's quiet strength changes everything. The scarf hit the floor like a silk prayer, and in that moment, something dark and ugly erupted from Richard Hendricks. "I knew it." His voice boomed across the store, drawing every eye toward them. "You people can't keep your hands off things that don't belong to you." Evelyn straightened slowly, the photograph of Harold clutched in her trembling hand. "Sir, it was an accident. I was just—" "Don't lie to me." Hendricks stepped closer, his face flushed red with a rage that seemed disproportionate to the moment. "I've been watching you since you walked in here, casing the place, touching everything with your dirty hands." The words hit Evelyn like physical blows. She'd heard variations of them before, whispered in grocery stores, muttered in restaurants. But never this loud, never this public. Around them, other customers stood frozen, their faces a mixture of shock and uncomfortable recognition. Jordan felt his legs go weak. This wasn't subtle anymore. This wasn't something he could pretend to misunderstand or explain away. The naked hatred in his manager's voice stripped away every excuse he'd ever made for staying silent. "Please," Evelyn said, her voice maintaining its dignity even as her eyes filled with tears. "I was going to purchase the scarf. I have money." "Money?" Hendricks laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. "What'd you do, steal someone's purse? Rob some old white lady at the bus stop?" The accusation hung in the air like poison. Evelyn's breath caught, and for a moment she looked every one of her 73 years. The proud woman who had entered the store just minutes ago seemed to fold inward, as if trying to make herself smaller, invisible. "I have never stolen anything in my life," she whispered, but her voice was so soft it barely carried. "Of course you haven't." Hendricks' tone dripped with sarcasm. "You're all innocent, aren't you? Just poor, innocent victims." He reached down and snatched the photograph from her hands before she could react. Harold's face smiled up from the old picture, young, hopeful, wearing his graduation robes. "Who's this?" "Your dealer, your pimp from back in the day." The words were a dagger straight to Evelyn's heart. To hear her beloved Harold, a man who had spent his life fighting for justice and dignity, referred to in such terms was more than she could bear. "Give that back," she said, her voice stronger now, but still shaking. "Please, that's my husband." "Your husband?" Hendricks examined the photo with mock interest. "Looks like trouble to me. Probably where you learned all your tricks." Something shifted in Evelyn's posture. The tears stopped. Her spine straightened. For just a moment, Jordan glimpsed the steel beneath her gentle exterior, the strength that had supported a civil rights lawyer through decades of threats and challenges. "His name was Harold Washington," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the silent store. "He was a lawyer, a good man, and he would have—" "I don't care if he was the Pope," Hendricks exploded. "You're nothing but a common thief, and I want you out of my store." He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the soft flesh above her elbow. Evelyn gasped, more from surprise than pain, but the sound seemed to push Hendricks over an edge he'd been teetering on. "Don't you dare make a sound," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "Don't you dare try to play the victim here." Jordan took a step forward, his heart hammering. "Mr. Hendricks, maybe we should—" "Stay back, Matthews. This doesn't concern you." But it did concern him. It concerned him more than anything ever had. Watching this elderly woman, who reminded him so much of his own grandmother, being degraded and terrorized, was tearing something apart inside his chest. Evelyn tried to pull away from Hendrik's grip, but he held tight. "Please, you're hurting me." "Hurting you?" His laugh was vicious. "You want to know what hurt is? Hurt is having people like you come into decent establishments." The slap came without warning. Hendrik's open palm connected with Evelyn's cheek with a sound that seemed to echo off every surface in the store. Her head snapped to the side, and she stumbled backward, catching herself against a display rack. The silence that followed was deafening. Evelyn raised her hand to her cheek, her fingers tracing the red mark that was already beginning to darken. She looked up at Hendrix with an expression Jordan would never forget, not hatred, not even surprise, but a deep, weary sadness that seemed to carry the weight of history. "You just struck an elderly woman," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears now streaming down her face. "In front of all these people, you actually put your hands on me." For the first time, Hendrix seemed to realize what he'd done. He looked around at the shocked faces surrounding them, at the children who had witnessed his violence, at the phones that were now being pulled from pockets and purses. She was stealing," he stammered, but his voice had lost its conviction. "No," said a voice from the crowd. An older white woman stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "I watched the whole thing. She wasn't stealing anything. She was just looking at scarves." "That's right." Another voice chimed in. "She didn't do anything wrong." But Hendrix was beyond reason now, beyond the ability to back down gracefully. "All of you need to mind your own business. This is my store, and I'll run it how I see fit." Jordan found himself moving without conscious thought. He walked to where Evelyn stood, still holding her cheek, and gently picked up the photograph of Harold from where it had fallen. "Mrs.," he said softly, offering her the picture. "Washington," she replied, accepting the photograph with hands that shook only slightly. "Evelyn Washington." "Mrs. Washington, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry this happened to you." She looked at him, really looked at him, and Jordan saw something in her eyes that made his throat tight. Not accusation, not anger, but a quiet understanding that somehow made him feel both smaller and larger than he'd ever felt before. "Thank you," she said simply. Hendrix was screaming now, but his words seemed to fade into background noise. Security guards were approaching, summoned by other store managers who had heard the commotion. Customers were filming, talking among themselves, shaking their heads in disgust. But in that moment, Jordan only saw Evelyn Washington, a woman who had been struck down but refused to be broken, whose dignity remained intact even as everything around her erupted into chaos. He didn't know it yet, but this moment would change everything. Not just for him, not just for her, but for everyone who had witnessed the casual cruelty that had lived in the shadows for too long. The empire of comfortable silence was about to crumble, and it would all begin with an elderly woman who refused to let go of a photograph of the man she loved. The mall security guards arrived like cautious referees entering a boxing ring after the knockout had already been delivered. Evelyn stood in the center of the chaos, still holding Harold's photograph, while Hendrix paced behind the counter like a caged animal, realizing his cage door was wide open. "What seems to be the problem here?" Officer Martinez, the head of mall security, surveyed the scene with the weary expression of someone who'd seen too much human ugliness in retail settings. "This woman was shoplifting," Hendrix declared, his voice loud but lacking the venom it had carried moments before. "I caught her red-handed, and when I tried to detain her, she became aggressive." The lie hung in the air like smoke. Jordan felt it settle in his lungs, making it hard to breathe. Around them, several customers shifted uncomfortably, their faces reflecting the same struggle he was experiencing, the choice between comfortable silence and uncomfortable truth. Evelyn said nothing. She simply stood there, her cheek still bearing the red imprint of Hendrix's palm, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd. The fight seemed to have drained out of her, leaving behind a hollow stillness that was somehow more devastating than any tears. "Ma'am?" Officer Martinez addressed her gently. "What's your version of events?" For a long moment, Evelyn didn't respond. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet that everyone had to lean forward to hear her. "I was looking at scarves," she said. "I dropped a photograph by accident. The scarf fell. He said. Things about my husband. About me." Her fingers traced the edge of Harold's picture. "Then he hit me." "She's lying." Hendricks exploded, but his protest sounded desperate now. "You can't trust." "Sir." Martinez's tone carried a warning. "Let me handle this." Jordan watched Evelyn's face and saw something that made his chest ache. It wasn't just sadness or pain. It was resignation. The look of someone who had been through this dance before, who knew that her word would be questioned while her attackers would be accepted. She was already retreating inside herself, already building walls against the disappointment that was surely coming. "Did anyone else witness what happened?" Martinez asked the crowd. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Jordan knew at least a dozen people had seen everything, but one by one, they found reasons to study their shoes or check their phones. The older white woman who had spoken up earlier was no longer in sight. She'd melted away into the crowd like most people do when the cameras stop rolling and real consequences loom. "I saw it." The words left Jordan's mouth before he could stop them. Every head turned toward him, including Hendricks, whose face went through a rapid progression of emotions: surprise, betrayal, and finally, rage. "Jordan, you don't know what you're talking about," Hendricks said, his voice carrying a clear threat. "You were in the stockroom. You didn't see anything." "I was right here," Jordan replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "I saw everything." Martinez pulled out his notepad. "And what did you see?" Jordan's throat felt dry as sandpaper. He could feel Hendricks' eyes boring into him, could practically hear his job evaporating. But when he looked at Evelyn, still standing there with that heartbreaking dignity, the words came easier. Mrs. Washington was looking at a scarf. She dropped a photograph, and when she bent to pick it up, she accidentally knocked another scarf off its hanger. Mr. Hendricks accused her of trying to steal it. He grabbed her arm, and then Jordan's voice cracked. Then he slapped her, hard. "That's a lie." Hendricks' face had gone purple. "Martinez, this kid is trying to save his own skin. He's been stealing from the register for months. I've been building a case against him." The accusation hit Jordan like a physical blow. He'd never stolen so much as a penny, but he could see in Hendricks' eyes that the man would say anything now to discredit him. "Is that true?" Martinez asked. "No," Jordan said firmly. "I've never stolen anything. And I'm not lying about what I saw." But even as he said it, he could see doubt creeping into the security officer's expression. It was Hendricks' word and position against a young employee who clearly had something to gain by protecting a customer. The mathematics of credibility were working against them. Evelyn finally looked up from Harold's photograph. Her eyes met Jordan's across the small crowd, and in them he saw a flicker of something, not hope exactly, but acknowledgement. She understood what standing up was costing him. "Officer Martinez," she said quietly, "I don't want to press charges." The words hit Jordan like a punch to the gut. "Mrs. Washington, you can't." "I just want to go home," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm tired. I just want to go home." Hendricks' expression shifted to one of barely concealed triumph. "You see? She knows she was in the wrong. Case closed." But Martinez wasn't entirely convinced. Years of security work had taught him to read between the lines, and everything about this situation felt wrong. The elderly woman's demeanor, the conflicting stories, the way Hendricks was pushing too hard for a quick resolution. "Ma'am, if someone assaulted you, you have every right to—" "No one assaulted me," Evelyn said, the lie obvious to everyone present. "I'm fine. I just want to leave." She turned to go, moving with the careful steps of someone who had aged a decade in the span of 10 minutes. Jordan watched her walk away, feeling like he was witnessing something fundamental break inside the world. "Wait," he called after her. She paused but didn't turn around. "This isn't right," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "None of this is right." Evelyn's shoulders sagged slightly. "Right and wrong don't always matter, son," she said without turning. "Sometimes survival is enough." She walked away then, leaving Jordan standing in the wreckage of his comfortable illusions. Around him, the crowd began to disperse, eager to return to their shopping and their lives, to forget the ugliness they'd witnessed. "Show's over, people," Hendricks announced with false joviality. "Sorry for the disturbance. We'll be back to normal in just a moment." But Jordan knew nothing would ever be normal again. He looked at Hendricks, really looked at him, and saw not just his boss, but something much uglier. A man so comfortable with his casual cruelty that he could slap an elderly woman and then pretend it never happened. "Jordan," Hendricks said, his voice deceptively calm. "My office, now." As Jordan walked toward what he knew would be his termination, he caught a glimpse of Evelyn through the store window. She was sitting on a bench in the mall corridor, staring at Harold's photograph, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. In that moment, Jordan understood that some things were worth losing everything for. The only question was whether he had the courage to act on that understanding before it was too late. The resistance was crumbling, but sometimes Jordan realized you had to let the old world break completely before you could build something better in its place. The sound of Hendricks' office door slamming behind Jordan felt like the final nail in his career's coffin, but strangely, he felt lighter than he had in months. Through the glass partition, he could see his former manager pacing, probably rehearsing the speech about insubordination and disappointing choices. But Jordan's attention was drawn to the window overlooking the mall corridor, where Evelyn still sat on the bench, clutching Harold's photograph like a lifeline. "You're fired," Hendricks announced, not bothering with pleasantries. "Clean out your locker and get out. And don't expect a reference, not after the stunt you just pulled." Jordan nodded, unsurprised. "Can I ask you something, Mr. Hendricks? Make it quick. Was it worth it? Hitting a 73-year-old woman over a $60 scarf?" Hendricks' face darkened. "She was shoplifting. I was protecting store property." "No," Jordan said quietly. "You were protecting something else entirely, and we both know what that was." He left before Hendricks could respond, grabbing his jacket from his locker and walking out into the mall corridor. His entire life had just imploded, but all he could think about was the elderly woman on the bench who had chosen to protect her dignity by sacrificing her justice. Evelyn looked up as his shadow fell across her. Up close, the mark on her cheek looked even worse, angry and purple, a stark reminder of the violence that had erupted over nothing more than a dropped photograph. "You lost your job," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah." Jordan sat down beside her, uninvited, but somehow knowing it was the right thing to do. "Seems like a fair trade." "Fair?" Evelyn's laugh was bitter. "Son, nothing about this was fair. You stood up for an old woman you don't even know, and now you're unemployed. I've seen enough of this world to know that's not how fair works." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the mall's usual afternoon crowd flow around them. Teenagers gossiping, mothers pushing strollers, elderly couples walking hand in hand, normal life continuing as if nothing had happened, as if the world hadn't just revealed one of its uglier truths right in front of the gap. "Why didn't you press charges?" Jordan asked. Evelyn was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades. "Because I'm tired, son. Bone tired. You know how many fights I've fought in my life. How many times I've stood up and demanded justice, only to watch the system protect men like him." She touched Harold's photograph gently. "My husband used to say that every battle was worth fighting, that we had to keep pushing because someone had to. But Harold's not here anymore, and her voice trailed off. "You're still here," Jordan said softly. "And what happened back there, that wasn't right." "Right and wrong." Evelyn shook her head. "You're young. You still believe those words mean something, don't they?" Before Evelyn could answer, a commotion erupted near the food court. Raised voices, the sound of something crashing to the floor. Jordan stood up instinctively, his retail-trained reflexes still intact, and saw a familiar figure in the distance, Hendricks, gesticulating wildly at what appeared to be another customer. "He's at it again," Jordan muttered. Evelyn rose slowly, her eyes focusing on the disturbance. Even from this distance, they could see the pattern repeating. Hendricks looming over someone, his body language aggressive and threatening. "Some people never learn," she said quietly. They found themselves walking toward the commotion without discussing it, drawn by the same magnetic pull that makes people slow down at accident scenes. As they got closer, the details became clearer. Hendricks was confronting a young Hispanic woman who was trying to manage 3 small children while ordering food. Apparently, her card had been declined, and Hendricks, who had apparently taken it upon himself to patrol the entire mall, was making a scene about people wasting everyone's time. "This is what you people always do," Hendricks was saying. "Loud enough for half the food court to hear. Come in here with no money, act like you belong, and then expect everyone else to." "Sir, please," the woman said, her voice shaking as her children pressed closer to her legs. "I just need to call my bank. There must be a mistake." The only mistake was letting you in here in the first place. Jordan felt that familiar surge of anger, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a sense of purpose that he'd never experienced in all his months of folding clothes and ringing up purchases. "Hey Hendricks," he called out, his voice carrying across the food court. His former manager turned, his face cycling through surprise and annoyance when he saw Jordan approaching with Evelyn beside him. "You're trespassing, Matthews. I already called security to have you removed." "Funny," Jordan said, stopping just outside Hendricks' personal space. "I was thinking the same thing about you. What's that supposed to mean?" Jordan looked around at the crowd that had gathered, mall employees, customers, teenagers with phones already out and recording. "I was thinking that maybe it's time people knew exactly what kind of person you really are." "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Jordan's voice was getting stronger, more confident. "How many times have you done this, Hendricks? How many people have you humiliated and terrorized while hiding behind your little bit of authority?" Evelyn stepped forward, her presence seeming to command attention despite her soft voice. "What's your name, dear?" she asked the young mother. "Rosa," the woman replied, still clutching her children protectively. "Rosa, how much do you need for lunch?" $27, but I can call my bank." Evelyn was already pulling out her wallet. She counted out $30 and handed it to Rosa, whose eyes filled with tears. "I can't take your money," Rosa protested.
"It's not charity,"
Evelyn said gently. "It's community. And community is what people like him can't understand." She looked directly at Hendricks. "They think power comes from tearing others down. They never learned that real power comes from lifting people up." Hendricks' face had gone red again. "This is harassment. I'm calling the police." "Good," Evelyn said calmly. "When they arrive, we can discuss what happened in the clothing store. I've been thinking about that, and I realize I was wrong to let it go. Some things are worth fighting for, even when you're tired." Jordan saw something shift in her posture, a straightening of her spine that reminded him of steel beneath silk. The woman who had walked away in defeat an hour ago was gone, replaced by someone who had remembered her own strength. "You can't prove anything," Hendricks said, but his voice had lost its conviction. "Can't I?" Evelyn smiled, and there was something in that smile that made Hendricks take a step backward. "Son, you made one very big mistake when you hit me." "What's that?" "You assumed I was powerless." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Jordan found himself holding his breath, sensing that something fundamental was about to shift. Around them, the crowd pressed closer, phones recording, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Evelyn reached into her purse and pulled out her cell phone, an older model, but functional. "I think it's time I made some calls." Evelyn's fingers moved across her phone's keypad with surprising speed for someone her age. But Jordan noticed something else, the way she held herself as she dialed. There was a quiet authority in her posture that hadn't been there before, as if making this call had awakened something that had been sleeping. "Hello, Patricia? It's Evelyn Washington." "Yes." Harold's wife. Her voice carried clearly across the food court, and Jordan saw Hendricks' expression shift from defiance to confusion. "I need you to do something for me, dear. I need you to call Channel 7, Channel 12, and that nice young man from the Tribune who wrote the piece about Harold last year." "Yes, I'm sure." Tell them Evelyn Washington has a story for them." The name seemed to ripple through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Jordan heard whispers starting, "Washington, isn't that the civil rights lawyer? I thought she looked familiar." Hendricks' face had gone pale. "Washington," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn ended her call and looked at him with the same steady gaze she'd maintained throughout their entire encounter. "Harold Washington was my husband for 48 years, she said simply. "You might have heard of him." Jordan felt the pieces clicking together in his mind. Harold Washington, the civil rights attorney who had desegregated 3 school districts in Alabama, the man who had argued cases before the Supreme Court, the lawyer who had spent decades fighting the exact kind of prejudice they'd just witnessed. "You said he looked like trouble," Evelyn continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You said he looked like a dealer, a pimp." Harold Washington, who graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law School in 1954. Harold Washington, who spent his life ensuring that people like Rosa here could eat in any restaurant they chose, shop in any store, live wherever they could afford. She walked closer to Hendricks, who seemed to shrink with each step she took. Harold Washington, who received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from 3 different presidents. That Harold Washington was my husband, and you dishonored his memory with your ignorance. The food court had gone completely silent, except for the soft hum of the smoothie machines and the distant sounds of the mall beyond. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of what was happening. Rosa stepped forward, her eyes wide with recognition. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about Harold Washington. He helped my great-uncle get into college when no one else would take him. She always said he was a saint." "He was just a man," Evelyn said softly, but her smile was warm. "A good man who believed that everyone deserved dignity and respect. He would have liked you, Rosa." Jordan found his voice. "Mrs. Washington, I had no idea." "Of course you didn't, son. And that's exactly how I prefer it." She tucked the phone back into her purse. "Harold used to say that the moment you start expecting special treatment because of who you are, you forget who you're supposed to be serving." Hendricks seemed to find his voice, though it came out as more of a croak. "You can't. I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Evelyn's laugh was sharp now, cutting. "Your job was to hit an elderly customer because she accidentally knocked a scarf off a hanger. Your job was to call my deceased husband a criminal. Your job was to terrorize Rosa here because her card was declined." She pulled out Harold's photograph again, studying his face with infinite tenderness before looking back at Hendricks. "Let me tell you about Harold's job. Harold's job was getting death threats for defending people's right to exist in peace. Harold's job was having crosses burned on our lawn because he believed black children deserved the same education as white children. Harold's job was being spat on, cursed at, and threatened every single day, and he never once raised his hand in anger against another human being." The power in her voice was building now, and Jordan could see why she had been able to stand beside Harold Washington for nearly 50 years of civil rights battles. This wasn't just grief talking. This was decades of accumulated strength and wisdom finally finding its voice again. "You want to know what your real job is?" she continued, stepping even closer to Hendricks. "Your real job is to treat every person who walks through that door with basic human decency. Your real job is to see the humanity in others, regardless of the color of their skin or the size of their bank account. Your real job is to make this world a little bit better than you found it, not to perpetuate the same tired hatred that Harold spent his life fighting." Hendricks looked around desperately, perhaps hoping for support from the crowd, but he found only disgusted faces and recording phones. The comfortable anonymity that had protected his casual cruelty was evaporating like morning mist. "Mrs. Washington," he started, his voice taking on a pleading tone. "That's the problem right there," she interrupted. "You didn't know, and you didn't care to know. You looked at me and saw nothing but your own prejudices reflected back." Jordan stepped forward. "Mrs. Washington, what can I do to help?" She studied his face for a long moment. "Can I ask you something, son?" "Anything." "Why did you speak up for me back there? You didn't know who I was. You just saw an old black woman getting slapped around by your boss. What made you risk your job for a stranger? Jordan thought about it. Really thought about it. My grandmother, he said finally. She raised me after my parents died. She was about your age, and she had this dignity about her. You know, she never let anyone make her feel small, but she was gentle too. When I saw him hit you, his voice cracked. I saw her, and I knew she would never forgive me if I just stood there and did nothing. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, but they were different tears than the ones she'd shed earlier. These were tears of recognition, of connection across the artificial boundaries that society tries to build between people. What was her name? Dorothy. Dorothy Matthews. Dorothy raised a good man, Evelyn said, reaching out to squeeze his hand. Harold would have liked you too, Jordan. He always said you could measure a person's character by how they treated people who couldn't help them in return. In the distance, Jordan could see news vans beginning to arrive in the mall parking lot. Evelyn's calls had been answered with the kind of speed that only comes when a respected name is attached to a newsworthy story. It's starting, Evelyn said, following his gaze. Are you ready for this, son? Because once this story breaks, there's no going back. Your name will be attached to mine, and that brings responsibilities. Jordan looked at Hendricks, who was now frantically making phone calls of his own, probably to corporate headquarters or lawyers or anyone who might help him control the narrative that was rapidly spinning beyond his control. I'm ready, Jordan said, and meant it. Evelyn nodded approvingly. Then let's go teach the world what Harold Washington's legacy really looks like. Have you ever had a moment when you discovered someone's true identity or story completely changed how you saw a situation? Share your experience in the comments below. The news crews descended on Montgomery Mall like a perfectly choreographed storm. Jordan watched through the food court windows as reporters checked their equipment and camera operators scouted angles, all of them moving with the focused energy of people who knew they were about to capture something significant. Nervous? Evelyn asked, settling into a chair at a small table they'd claimed as their staging area. Rosa and her children had left with enough food for 3 meals, and Evelyn's phone number in case you ever need anything, dear, but not before Rosa had whispered a heartfelt blessing in Spanish that made Evelyn's eyes shine. Terrified, Jordan admitted, watching Hendricks pace frantically near the mall's information desk, his phone pressed to his ear. I've never been on TV before. Neither had I, the first time, Evelyn said, smoothing down her dress. 1963, when Harold was arguing the Henderson versus Montgomery school board case. The reporters wanted to interview the wives, get the human interest angle. She smiled at the memory. I was so scared I could barely speak. But Harold told me something that day that I never forgot. What did he say? He said, Evie, the only difference between courage and fear is what you do while you're feeling both. She reached across the table and patted Jordan's hand. You've already shown more courage today than most people show in a lifetime, son. The rest is just conversation. Jordan looked down at their joined hands, his young and calloused from retail work, hers aged and soft but surprisingly strong. There was something profoundly comforting about her touch, a steadiness that seemed to flow from her into him. Can I ask you something personal, Mrs. Washington? Evelyn. And yes. How did you do it? All those years watching Harold fight battles that seemed impossible to win, watching him get threatened and attacked. How did you stay strong? Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of love and loss. The same way you stayed strong today. One moment at a time, one choice at a time. She pulled Harold's photograph from her purse again, running her thumb along the edge. People think strength is about not being afraid. But that's not true. Strength is about being terrified and showing up anyway. She looked up at Jordan, and he saw something in her eyes that made his chest tight, a vulnerability that she'd kept carefully hidden beneath her dignity. I haven't felt strong in months, she continued. Since Harold passed, I've been lost, like half of me died with him, you know? This morning when I came to the mall, it was the first time I'd left the house for something other than groceries or doctor's appointments. I saw that scarf and thought maybe I could buy something beautiful, something that would make me feel like myself again. And then Hendrix happened. And then you happened, she corrected, her smile returning. You reminded me that Harold didn't fight his battles alone. He had people who stood with him, people who risked everything because they believed in something bigger than themselves. Jordan felt tears prick his eyes. I don't know if I believe in anything that big. You do, Evelyn said firmly. You believe in doing right by people who can't protect themselves. You believe in speaking truth, even when it costs you everything. You believe in the same things Harold believed in. You just haven't put words to it yet. A commotion near the mall entrance caught their attention. A woman in a sharp business suit was striding toward them, flanked by what looked like corporate security. Her expression was all business, and Jordan felt his stomach drop. That'll be the district manager, he said. Probably here to do damage control. Probably, Evelyn agreed, but she didn't seem concerned. If anything, she looked almost amused. Jordan, can I tell you something about Harold that most people don't know? Sure. He was scared before every single case. Every court appearance, every argument, every press conference. He'd spend hours the night before, pacing the house, convinced he was going to fail. But you know what he discovered? Jordan shook his head. Fear is just another form of caring. The more scared you are, the more something matters to you. And when something really matters, you find strength you didn't know you had. The district manager was getting closer, and Jordan could see Hendrix gesticulating wildly as he pointed in their direction. But instead of the anxiety he expected to feel, Jordan found himself experiencing something else, a calm certainty that felt almost foreign after months of doubt and compromise. Evelyn, he said, using her first name for the first time. What happens after this? After the interviews and the investigation and all the noise dies down? She considered the question seriously. I don't know, she admitted. For the first time in 6 months, I don't have tomorrow planned out. But I think that might be okay. Harold used to say that the best adventures begin when you don't know how they're going to end. Adventures? Jordan couldn't help but smile at the word. Is that what this is? What else would you call it? Two strangers, thrown together by circumstance, about to take on a system that's been broken for decades. She leaned forward conspiratorially. Sounds like the beginning of every good adventure story I've ever heard. The district manager had reached their table now, her corporate smile firmly in place. Mrs. Washington. I'm Sandra Chen, district manager for Montgomery Mall. I understand there's been some kind of misunderstanding with one of our store managers. Misunderstanding? Evelyn's eyebrows rose slightly. Is that what we're calling assault these days? Miss Chen's smile faltered just a fraction. Perhaps we could discuss this privately. I'm sure we can reach some kind of arrangement that would be satisfactory to everyone involved. Jordan watched Evelyn's face transform. The gentle grandmother was gone, replaced by someone who had spent decades dealing with people who thought problems could be made to disappear with the right combination of money and silence. Miss Chen, Evelyn said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of practice. I'm going to save you some time. There is no amount of money, no non-disclosure agreement, no private settlement that will make this go away. Your employee assaulted a customer in front of witnesses, and now the world is going to know about it. Mrs. Washington, surely you understand. I understand perfectly. Evelyn stood up, and somehow the simple act of rising made her seem to tower over the corporate executive. I understand that you're here to protect your company's reputation, not to ensure justice for your customers. I understand that you'd rather sweep this under the rug than address the systemic problems that allowed it to happen. She gestured toward Jordan. But you see, I'm not alone in this. I have an ally who believes in doing the right thing, even when it's hard. And together we're going to make sure this never happens to anyone else. Jordan stood as well, feeling the truth of her words settle into his bones. For the first time in months, maybe years, he knew exactly where he belonged and what he was fighting for. The adventure, as Evelyn called it, was just beginning. The media circus that erupted around Montgomery Mall over the next hour was unlike anything Jordan had ever witnessed. News vans lined the parking lot like electronic vultures, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky, hungry to broadcast the story of Harold Washington's widow and the injustice she'd suffered. But as Jordan stood beside Evelyn, watching her field questions from reporters with the grace of someone who'd done this dance before, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. It started with a phone call. Evelyn's cell rang just as she was finishing an interview with Channel 7, her voice steady and clear as she recounted the events in prestige clothing. She glanced at the caller ID, and Jordan saw her entire demeanor change. The confidence that had been building throughout the afternoon seemed to evaporate in an instant. "I need to take this," she said quietly, stepping away from the cameras. Jordan watched her walk toward a quieter corner near the fountain, her phone pressed to her ear. Even from a distance, he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she seemed to fold in on herself as the conversation progressed. Jordan Matthews. He turned to find a young woman with a press badge approaching, her recorder already running. "I'm Jennifer Walsh from the Montgomery Tribune. Can you tell me about your relationship with Mrs. Washington? How long have you two been working together on civil rights issues?" "We just met today," Jordan said, distracted by Evelyn's increasingly agitated body language. "I was just a retail employee who saw something wrong and tried to help." "Just met today?" The reporter's eyes lit up with interest. "So you're saying this wasn't a planned protest? You didn't know who she was when you defended her?" "No, Jordan stopped, realizing how his words might be interpreted. "Look, it wasn't about who she was. It was about what was happening to her." But the reporter was already moving on, clearly more interested in the angle of a spontaneous uprising than the reality of two people doing what was right. Jordan felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach, the sense that the narrative was spinning beyond their control. Evelyn returned from her phone call, looking like she'd aged another decade. Her face was pale, her hands shaking slightly as she tucked her phone away. "Evelyn? What's wrong?" She looked at him with eyes full of something he hadn't seen before. Fear. Not the kind of fear that comes from facing down a bully, but the deep, existential fear of someone who's just realized they've made a terrible miscalculation. "That was my lawyer," she said, her voice barely audible above the mall's ambient noise. "Harold's former partner. He says, I need to stop talking to reporters immediately." "Why? What's wrong?" Evelyn's laugh was hollow. "Everything. Jordan, I've made a horrible mistake. When Harold died, he left some legal matters unresolved. Cases that were still in appeals, settlements that hadn't been finalized. My lawyer says that by going public like this, by associating myself with a civil rights cause again, I could jeopardize millions of dollars in awards that were supposed to go to the families Harold fought for." Jordan felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "I don't understand." The other side, the school districts, the corporations Harold sued, they're claiming that my inflammatory statements today constitute a breach of confidentiality agreements signed as part of various settlements. They're saying that if I continue with this media campaign, they'll withdraw from all pending agreements and tie everything up in court for decades. The implications hit Jordan like a physical blow. The families Harold fought for would lose everything. 40 years of legal victories gone. Families who've been waiting for compensation for their suffering, left with nothing. Evelyn's voice broke, all because I wanted to feel relevant again, because I wanted to honor Harold's memory by fighting one more battle. Around them, the media circus continued its relentless dance. Reporters were interviewing other shoppers, getting reactions, building the story into something bigger than what had actually happened. Jordan could see Hendricks in the distance, surrounded by what looked like a team of lawyers, probably preparing his own narrative. "But that's blackmail," Jordan protested. "They can't hold those settlements hostage because you spoke out about what happened today." "They can and they will," Evelyn said, sinking into a nearby chair. "Harold always said the law was a weapon that could cut both ways. Today I learned how sharp the other edge is." The crushing weight of unintended consequences settled over them both. Jordan had imagined this moment as the beginning of justice, the point where truth would triumph over prejudice. Instead, it felt like standing in the wreckage of good intentions. "So what do we do?" he asked. Evelyn looked up at him, and in her eyes, he saw the same resignation he'd witnessed earlier when she'd refused to press charges. The fight was going out of her again, leaving behind only exhaustion and regret. "We stop," she said simply. "I call a press conference, apologize for any misunderstanding, say that Mr. Hendricks was just doing his job and I overreacted. The story dies, the settlements are safe, and everyone moves on with their lives. Except you," Jordan said fiercely. "And except everyone else who gets slapped around by men like Hendricks." "Sometimes sacrifice is the only choice available," Evelyn replied, but her voice lacked conviction. Harold understood that. There were cases he didn't take, battles he didn't fight, because the collateral damage would have been too great. Jordan watched her retreat into herself, watched the light fade from her eyes, and felt something break inside his chest. This morning, she had been just another customer. Now she felt like family, like the grandmother he'd lost, like the mentor he'd never had. Watching her give up was unbearable. "What if there was another way?" he asked. "There isn't. What if I took responsibility? What if I said this was all my idea, that I manipulated you into speaking out? That way, you could distance yourself from the civil rights angle and the settlements would be safe." Evelyn looked at him with something approaching horror. "Jordan, no. That would destroy your reputation before you even have one. And it wouldn't work anyway. They have recordings of me speaking freely to reporters. Then we're just going to let him win. We're going to let Hendricks keep his job, keep terrorizing people, because some corporate lawyers found a loophole." "Yes," Evelyn said, and the word fell between them like a stone. "That's exactly what we're going to do. Because the alternative is destroying the legacy of every case Harold ever won, every family he ever helped." Jordan felt the last of his naive optimism crumble. This was what growing up felt like. He realized not the gradual accumulation of wisdom, but the sudden brutal understanding that doing the right thing sometimes meant accepting that wrong would triumph anyway. "I'm sorry," Evelyn whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry I dragged you into this. I'm sorry I made you believe that standing up would matter." "It did matter," Jordan said, even as his heart broke. "For a few hours, it mattered." But as he watched her pull out her phone to call off the fight they'd barely begun, Jordan wondered if mattering for a few hours was enough, or if they were about to learn that some victories were too expensive to claim. The shatter point had arrived, and everything they'd built was about to come crashing down. The silence in Jordan's studio apartment felt heavier than the media chaos they'd left behind at the mall. He sat on his second-hand couch, staring at the muted television where news anchors were already moving on to other stories, their brief fascination with Montgomery Mall's drama fading as quickly as it had ignited. The press conference Evelyn had called to clarify the misunderstanding had lasted exactly 7 minutes, long enough to watch a principled woman sacrifice her dignity on the altar of legal complexity. His phone buzzed with a text from his best friend Marcus. "Saw you on the news, bro. You okay?" Jordan stared at the message without responding. How could he explain that he felt simultaneously proud and hollow, that he'd discovered something important about himself in the same moment he'd learned how little individual courage mattered against institutional power? The knock on his door came at 9:47 p.m. Jordan almost didn't answer. He wasn't ready for well-meaning friends or opportunistic reporters. But something about the soft, measured rhythm of the knocking made him look through the peephole. Evelyn stood in the hallway, still wearing the same navy dress from that morning, though it looked wrinkled now, worn down by the weight of the day. She held a manila envelope in her hands. "I know it's late," she said when he opened the door, "but I couldn't sleep. I keep thinking about what you said about letting him win." Jordan stepped aside to let her in, noting how small she seemed in his sparse apartment. The woman who had commanded attention from news cameras just hours ago looked fragile now, almost breakable. "I brought you something," she said, sitting carefully on the edge of his couch. "Something I think you should see." She handed him the manila envelope. Inside were dozens of newspaper clippings, yellowed with age, headlines about school integration, voting rights cases, employment discrimination lawsuits. And in many of the photos, Jordan saw a younger Evelyn standing beside Harold, her face serious and determined. 43 years of fighting, she said quietly. 43 years of people telling us it was too dangerous, too expensive, too complicated to seek justice. You know what Harold used to say to those people? Jordan shook his head, though something in her tone suggested she was about to share something crucial. He'd say, "The cost of justice is always high, but the cost of injustice is higher still." She picked up one of the clippings, a photo of Harold arguing before the Supreme Court. "This case almost broke us financially. We mortgaged our house 3 times to keep it going. Harold's partners said he was obsessed, that he was risking everything for a principle. They were right. What happened? We won. And because we won, 300 children got to attend integrated schools. 300 families had a better future." She looked at Jordan directly. The lawyers were right, Harold was risking everything. But what they didn't understand was that everything was already at risk if we did nothing. Jordan felt something stirring in his chest. Not hope, exactly, but a recognition of possibility. The settlements Harold won for other families, are they really at risk? Evelyn's smile was sad but knowing. "I've spent the evening on the phone with some very smart lawyers, son. People who worked with Harold. People who understand how these legal games are played. You want to know what they told me?" "Yes. They told me that the corporate lawyers are bluffing. The settlements Harold negotiated are ironclad. They can't be voided because a widow spoke truthfully about being assaulted. But they're counting on me being too scared, too isolated, too tired to call their bluff." The words hit Jordan like electricity. "You mean?" I let them intimidate me into silence when I should have known better. Harold spent decades fighting exactly these kinds of scare tactics. He would be ashamed of how quickly I folded. Jordan sank into his chair across from her. "So what do we do now? The story's already dead. The reporters have moved on." "Have they?" Evelyn pulled out her phone and showed him the screen. "I've received 47 phone calls tonight. Reporters, civil rights organizations, people who saw the press conference and recognized what was really happening. The story isn't dead, Jordan. It's just beginning." She leaned forward, and Jordan saw the fire returning to her eyes, the same strength that had sustained her through decades of battles alongside Harold. "But I can't do this alone. I'm 73 years old, and I've been out of the fight for too long. I need someone who understands what it costs to stand up for what's right. Someone who's already proven they're willing to pay that price." Jordan's throat felt tight. "You want me to?" "I want you to be my partner in this. Not my assistant, not my helper, my partner." Harold always said that movements aren't built by heroes. They're built by ordinary people who decide that ordinary isn't good enough anymore. The choice stretched out before Jordan like a chasm. On one side lay the safe path: find another retail job, keep his head down, live quietly. On the other side lay uncertainty, risk, and the probability of more fights like today's, more moments when doing the right thing would cost everything he had. "I don't know anything about civil rights law," he said. Neither did Harold when he started. "Knowledge can be learned. Courage is rarer. I don't have any money, any connections, any—" "You have something more important," Evelyn interrupted. "You have the ability to see injustice and act on it, even when acting costs you dearly. That's not common, son. That's precious." Jordan thought about his grandmother Dorothy, about the dignity she'd carried through decades of working jobs that barely paid enough to survive. He thought about Harold Washington, about the kind of legacy a person could build by refusing to accept that wrong was inevitable. He thought about Rosa and her children, about the casual cruelty they might face tomorrow and the next day if people like Hendrix faced no consequences for their actions. Most of all, he thought about the moment that morning when he'd watched an elderly woman get slapped and had to choose between comfort and conscience. "What would we do first?" he asked. Evelyn's smile was radiant. "We'd call Richard Hendrix and let him know that his problems are just beginning. Then we'd call every reporter who's been trying to reach me tonight and tell them the real story, that this isn't about one incident in one store. It's about a pattern of discrimination that's been allowed to flourish because people have been too frightened or too isolated to fight back. And then we'd start building something Harold would be proud of. A partnership between generations, between different backgrounds, united by the simple belief that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. Jordan looked at the newspaper clippings scattered across his coffee table, evidence of what two people could accomplish when they refused to accept injustice as inevitable. The choice had been made the moment he'd stepped forward to defend a stranger. Everything since then had just been learning to live with the consequences of courage. "Okay," he said simply. "Let's do it." Evelyn reached across the space between them and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. Harold used to say that the most important battles are fought not by people who aren't afraid, but by people who are afraid and choose to fight anyway. "Are you afraid?" Jordan asked. "Terrified," she admitted. "But I'm more afraid of what happens if we don't fight." Jordan nodded, understanding completely. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new obstacles, new people telling them that justice was too expensive or too complicated to pursue. But tonight, in his small apartment, two unlikely allies had chosen to stand together against the comfortable tyranny of silence. The cost of justice was indeed high, but as Harold Washington had understood, the cost of injustice was always higher. 3 months later, Jordan stood in the conference room of Washington and Associates, the civil rights law firm that Evelyn had reopened in her late husband's honor, watching the morning news with a mixture of pride and disbelief. The anchor was reporting on the settlement. Montgomery Mall had agreed to pay $2.3 million in damages, implement comprehensive anti-discrimination training for all employees, and establish a community oversight board to monitor complaints. But the money, substantial as it was, wasn't what mattered most to Jordan. What mattered was the footage of Richard Hendricks walking out of the courthouse, his legal career in ruins, his comfortable world of casual cruelty finally held accountable. "You did it," Jordan said, turning to where Evelyn sat behind Harold's old desk, now covered with case files and legal briefs. At 73, she looked more energetic than she had in months, her purpose restored along with her fighting spirit. "We did it," she corrected, gesturing to the wall where their partnership agreement hung in a simple frame, Washington and Matthews, attorneys for social justice. Jordan's law school acceptance letter from Alabama University hung beside it, his evening classes finally paying off in an acceptance to their program starting that fall. "Mrs. Washington?" Their secretary's voice came through the intercom. "Channel 7 is here for the interview." The past 3 months had transformed them both. Evelyn had emerged from her grief-stricken isolation to become a fierce advocate once again, her decades of experience finally paired with renewed purpose. Jordan had discovered that his instinct for justice could be channeled into something larger than individual moments of courage, into systemic change that would protect people like Rosa and her children for years to come. The Hendricks case had been just the beginning. Word had spread through the community about the unlikely partnership between Harold Washington's widow and a young man who'd risked everything to defend a stranger. Other victims had come forward, people who'd suffered discrimination in employment, housing, public services. Cases that might have been ignored or dismissed were now finding their way to Washington and Matthews, where they received the kind of passionate advocacy that Harold had once provided. "Jordan," Evelyn said, as they prepared for the television interview, "do you remember what I told you that first day about adventures beginning when you don't know how they'll end?" "I remember. I know how this one ends now." Jordan raised an eyebrow. "Oh? With you taking the bar exam next year and officially becoming my partner, with Harold's legacy living on in a new generation, with that young mother Rosa starting law school herself next semester on the scholarship we established." Evelyn's smile was radiant. "With justice, son. It ends with justice." They walked into the main conference room where the camera crew was setting up. Through the large windows, Jordan could see Montgomery Mall in the distance, now under new management with diversity training posters visible in several storefronts and a community liaison office where customers could report discrimination safely. "Mrs. Washington, Mr. Matthews." The reporter began once the cameras were rolling. 3 months ago, you were strangers brought together by an incident of racial discrimination. Today, you're partners in one of the state's most successful civil rights firms. How did this transformation happen? Evelyn glanced at Jordan, and he saw in her eyes the same mixture of strength and vulnerability that had first moved him to act. It happened because someone decided that doing the right thing was more important than staying comfortable, she said. And it continued because we learned that individual courage becomes collective power when people choose to stand together. Jordan, you were just a retail worker when this began. Now you're headed to law school and working as a paralegal in a major civil rights firm. What would you say to other young people who witness injustice but feel powerless to act? Jordan thought about that morning 3 months ago. About the choice between speaking up and staying silent. I'd say that you're not as powerless as you think. The moment you decide to stand up for someone else, you become part of something bigger than yourself. You become part of the solution. And what about the critics who say that incidents like what happened at Montgomery Mall are isolated? That systemic racism isn't really a problem anymore. This time, Jordan and Evelyn answered together, their voices overlapping in perfect synchrony. Come spend a day with us. The interviewer smiled. You've both said that this partnership represents something larger than just a business relationship. Can you explain what you mean? Evelyn reached into her desk drawer and pulled out the photograph of Harold that had started everything. The picture that had fallen to the floor when Hendricks first confronted her. But now it sat in a new frame, and beside Harold's graduation photo was a newer picture. Jordan in his cap and gown from his college graduation, Evelyn beaming beside him like a proud grandmother. Harold used to say that progress doesn't happen in giant leaps, Evelyn said, holding up the frame. It happens in moments when people choose connection over division, when they choose to see each other's humanity instead of each other's differences. This partnership, she gestured between herself and Jordan, represents what's possible when people stop letting fear and prejudice divide them. What's next for Washington and Matthews? Jordan leaned forward, his voice filled with the quiet confidence that had replaced his earlier uncertainty. We've got 47 active cases representing people who've faced discrimination in housing, employment, education, and public accommodations. We're opening a second office in Birmingham next month, and we're launching a legal clinic to provide free services for low-income families. But most importantly, Evelyn added, we're training the next generation of civil rights attorneys. People who understand that justice isn't a destination, it's a practice. Something you do every day, in small ways and large ones. After the cameras stopped rolling, Jordan and Evelyn sat in comfortable silence, watching the late afternoon sun stream through the windows of their office. On the wall hung Harold's law degree alongside Jordan's paralegal certification, and dozens of thank you letters from clients whose lives had been changed by their work. Evelyn, Jordan said finally, can I ask you something? Always. Do you think Harold would be proud of what we've built here? Evelyn's laugh was warm and full of joy, the sound of someone who had rediscovered her purpose in life. Son Harold spent 40 years fighting battles that seemed impossible to win, working with people from all walks of life, who chose justice over comfort. What do you think he'd say about a 73-year-old widow and a 22-year-old former retail worker taking on the system together? Jordan grinned. He'd probably say it was about time. Exactly. Evelyn stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city where they'd already begun to make a difference. Harold used to say that the most important moment in any movement isn't when the powerful finally change, it's when ordinary people realize they have power too. Jordan joined her at the window, and together they watched the evening shift change at Montgomery Mall. New employees, better trained and better supervised, serving customers who looked like Rosa, like Evelyn, like himself. The work was far from finished, but the foundation was solid. 6 months ago, Jordan had been folding sweaters and avoiding confrontation. Today he was reviewing legal briefs for cases that would affect thousands of lives. The transformation hadn't been easy. Law school would be harder still, but every challenge felt meaningful now, part of something larger than personal advancement. You know what I learned from all this? Jordan said as they prepared to lock up the office for the evening. What's that? That heroes aren't people who aren't afraid. Heroes are people who are afraid and choose love anyway. Evelyn smiled. The same radiant smile that had sustained Harold through decades of battles and would now sustain their partnership through whatever came next. Harold would have liked that, she said. He would have liked you. As they walked out together into the warm Alabama evening, Jordan felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've found your calling. The slap that had echoed through Montgomery Mall 3 months ago had indeed brought an empire to its knees, not just the comfortable tyranny of casual discrimination, but the more insidious empire of individual powerlessness. Two strangers had become family. A moment of injustice had become a movement for change. And a young man who had once been afraid to speak up had learned that the most important battles are won not by the fearless, but by those who choose courage over comfort, connection over division, and justice over silence. The adventure, as Evelyn had called it, was far from over. But as Jordan walked beside his partner and mentor into whatever challenges tomorrow would bring, he knew that Harold Washington's legacy and the love that had sustained it would live on in every case they fought, every client they served, and every young person they inspired to stand up when standing up was hard. Love had indeed won at last, in ways that neither of them could have imagined when a photograph fell to a mall floor and changed everything.
This story shows how one moment of courage can create ripple effects that change not just individual lives, but entire communities. What moment in your life, whether big or small, do you think could have created similar ripples if you'd acted differently? Share your thoughts, and let's discuss how we can all be agents of positive change in our own communities. If this story of unexpected courage and justice touched your heart, wait until you see what's coming next. We've got another incredible tale of ordinary people creating extraordinary change that will leave you absolutely speechless. The next story is even more shocking, more emotional, and more inspiring than what you just witnessed. Click on that video appearing on your screen right now. Trust me, you don't want to miss this one. Thanks for staying with Jordan and Evelyn's journey until the very end.